When I walked into what everyone called the family house that Thanksgiving morning, carrying my famous sweet potato casserole, I never imagined I'd be eating dinner next to an 8-year-old while my parents explained to relatives how I just never quite got my life together. But when my nephew Tyler looked up at me from the kids' folding table and asked why the grown-ups didn't want to sit with us, I decided it was time to show everyone the real reason this house had been home to our family gatherings for the past 15 years. What happened next didn't just change Thanksgiving dinner, it changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls had been drifting from the kitchen since dawn, mixing with the crisp November air that slipped through the windows of the 2-story colonial on Elm Street. This was the 15th consecutive year our family had gathered in this house for Thanksgiving, and like clockwork, everyone had their roles. Mom would orchestrate the meal with military precision, Dad would carve the turkey while telling the same 3 jokes, and Jessica would arrive, fashionably late with Carlos and Tyler in tow, immediately becoming the center of attention. I had arrived at 8 in the morning, as I always did, letting myself in through the front door with the spare key I'd had since I was 18. The house felt familiar in that bone-deep way that only childhood homes can, even though technically, this hadn't been my childhood home. We'd moved here when I was already in college, after Grandma Dorothy passed away and left the house to the family. But 15 years of Thanksgiving mornings had created their own kind of muscle memory. Linda was already bustling around the kitchen, wearing the same burgundy apron she'd worn for every major holiday since I could remember. She looked up when I entered, flour dusting her hands and a slight frown creasing her forehead. "Oh, good. You're here early," she said. Not quite a greeting, but not unfriendly either. "The sweet potatoes need to go in the oven in about 20 minutes. Did you remember to bring brown sugar this time?" The question stung a little, a reference to 2 years ago when I'd forgotten one ingredient and heard about it for months afterward. "Yes, Mom. Extra brown sugar, just like you asked." I set the casserole dish on the counter, already preheated and ready to go. I'd woken up at 6 to make sure everything was perfect, knowing that any small mistake would become family lore. Robert wandered in from the living room, coffee mug in hand, wearing his traditional Thanksgiving outfit of khakis and a burgundy sweater that matched Mom's apron. "Morning, kiddo," he said, the same nickname he'd used since I was 12, though it felt increasingly strange now that I was 35 and had been financially independent for over a decade. "How's the tech world treating you?" This was always his opening question, delivered with the same tone he might use to ask about a hobby, rather than the career that had allowed me to pay off my student loans, buy a reliable car, and save enough money for a down payment on a house of my own someday. "It's going well, Dad. Just finished a major project last month." I didn't mention the promotion or the raise that came with it. Experience had taught me that sharing good news often led to subtle comments about how I was getting too big for my britches or needed to stay humble. The morning continued in this familiar pattern. I helped prep vegetables, set the dining room table with Grandma Dorothy's good china, and made sure the guest bathroom was stocked with fresh towels. Paul and Aunt Maria arrived around noon with Sophie, and the house began to fill with the comfortable chaos of family gathering. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to see each other, hugs and laughter echoing through the rooms. But I noticed something I'd been trying to ignore for years. While everyone asked about Jessica's latest promotion at the marketing firm and Carlos's success in sales, when people asked about me, the questions felt perfunctory. "How's work?" followed quickly by a change of subject. When I mentioned that I'd been thinking about looking for a house to buy, Uncle Paul chuckled and said, "Better to rent, less responsibility. Not everyone's cut out for home ownership." The comment landed weird, especially since I'd been managing my finances responsibly for years and had a better credit score than most of my relatives. But I let it slide, the way I'd learned to let most things slide when it came to family gatherings. Jessica and Carlos made their grand entrance around 2 in the afternoon, Tyler racing ahead of them into the house with the boundless energy of an 8-year-old who'd been cooped up in a car. Jessica looked stunning as always, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and boots that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She worked in marketing for a high-end cosmetics company and had always had an eye for style, something the family loved to praise. "Sorry we're late," she called out, though she didn't sound particularly sorry. Traffic was insane, and this one, she ruffled Tyler's hair affectionately, had to stop at every rest area between Denver and here. The family swarmed around them immediately. Tyler got scooped up by Grandpa Robert for airplane rides around the living room, while Jessica and Carlos were peppered with questions about work, their recent vacation to Cancun, and Carlos's new truck. I watched from the kitchen doorway, still, wearing Mom's spare apron, holding a wooden spoon I'd been using to stir gravy. "Alex!" Jessica finally noticed me and came over for a quick hug. "I love your sweater. Very practical." The pause before practical said everything I needed to know about what she really thought of my outfit choice. I'd worn a simple navy blue cardigan and dark jeans, nothing fancy but appropriate for a family dinner. Jessica, meanwhile, looked like she'd stepped out of a holiday catalog. "Thanks," I replied, deciding not to mention that I'd actually put thought into my outfit and had even considered buying something new for the occasion. "How was your trip?" "Amazing. We stayed at this incredible resort. Carlos surprised me with a couple's massage on the beach." She held up her hand to show off a new bracelet, silver with small turquoise stones. "He got me this from a local artisan. Isn't it gorgeous?" It was gorgeous, and I told her so, genuinely happy that she'd enjoyed her vacation. But there was something in the way she presented it that felt like a performance, as if she was demonstrating the kind of life she had versus the kind I lived. Jessica had always been the one who dated the right people, made the right career, moves, and generally seemed to glide through life while I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. As the afternoon progressed, the familiar family dynamics fell into place like a well-rehearsed play. Jessica held court in the living room, entertaining everyone with stories from her job and funny things Tyler had said recently. Carlos bonded with Dad and Uncle Paul over football and car talk. Mom and Aunt Maria discussed recipes and neighborhood gossip while putting finishing touches on the meal. I continued helping in the kitchen, a role I'd somehow inherited over the years. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because I'd started helping when I was younger, and the expectation had simply solidified over time. I didn't mind the work itself. Cooking had always been relaxing for me, but I was starting to notice how automatically everyone assumed I'd handle the behind-the-scenes tasks while Jessica got to be the entertainment. Around 4 o'clock, Mom announced that dinner would be ready in 30 minutes and asked everyone to start gathering in the dining room. This was always the most chaotic part of the day, with multiple generations trying to figure out seating, arrangements while keeping conversations going and managing Tyler's excitement. The dining room table was beautiful, set with Grandma Dorothy's china and crystal glasses that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the bay windows. Mom had outdone herself with the centerpiece, an arrangement of autumn leaves, small pumpkins and candles that made the whole room feel warm and festive. This was the moment I always looked forward to, when all the preparation paid off and we could finally sit down together as a family. But as people began claiming their seats, I realized something was wrong. The table, which normally seated 8 comfortably, had only 7 place settings. In the adjoining sunroom, a small folding table had been set up with a plastic tablecloth and Tyler's favorite dinosaur plates. "Oh, Alex," Mom said, noticing my confusion, "would you mind sitting at the little table with Tyler? We're a bit tight on space in here, and you know how he gets when he has to sit still for too long. You're so good with kids." The request hit me like cold water. I looked around the dining room, taking in the seating arrangement with fresh eyes. Jessica and Carlos had claimed the seats closest to the head of the table where Dad always sat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Uncle Paul and Aunt Maria were directly across from them. Sophie had the seat next to the window. Mom bustled between the kitchen and dining room. Everyone had a place at the adults' table except me. "I can sit with Tyler," Sophie offered, seeming to sense the awkwardness of the moment. No, Mom waved her off. "Alex doesn't mind. She's used to helping out." The way she said it made my role sound like a job description rather than a family relationship. I stood there for a moment, looking at the folding table that had been set up like an afterthought. Tyler was already seated, swinging his legs and arranging his dinosaur figures around his plate, completely oblivious to the implications of the seating arrangement. He was a sweet kid, and spending time with him wasn't the problem. The problem was what the seating choice represented. At 35 years old, with a successful career, my own apartment, and a savings account that could probably cover everyone else's credit card debt combined, I was being seated at the kids' table. Not because of space constraints. The dining room table could easily fit 8 if someone had bothered to expand it or rearrange the chairs. Not because Tyler needed supervision. He was well behaved and could easily sit with the adults for an hour-long meal. I was being seated at the kids' table because, somehow, in my family's eyes, that's where I belonged. "You know what, Tyler?" I said, forcing brightness into my voice for his sake. "This looks like the best seat in the house. We can see the backyard and watch for squirrels while we eat." Tyler's face lit up. "Really? And we can talk about dinosaurs without boring the grown-ups?" "Absolutely. You can tell me all about your latest discoveries." As I settled into the small plastic chair clearly designed for someone half my size, I heard the conversation resume at the adult table. Jessica was telling a story about a difficult client at work, and everyone was laughing at her impressions of the woman's demanding personality. The story was funny. Jessica was a good storyteller, and I found myself smiling despite the growing knot in my stomach. But something had shifted in that moment of being relegated to the kids' table. A clarity I'd been avoiding for years suddenly crystallized. This wasn't about space or practicality or helping with Tyler. This was about hierarchy, about how my family saw me and my place in the family structure. And for the first time, I started to wonder if that hierarchy was based on assumptions that weren't quite accurate. Tyler chatted happily throughout the meal, his enthusiasm for paleontology infectious even in my current mood. He told me about a museum exhibit he'd visited with his class and drew pictures of different dinosaurs on his napkin. His innocence and genuine excitement reminded me that not everything about this situation was bad. Just the part where my own family had essentially demoted me to child status. From the adult table, I could hear fragments of conversation. Jessica talking about her promotion prospects. Carlos discussing a hunting trip he was planning with friends. Dad sharing stories about his retirement hobbies. Mom organizing the cleanup, schedule, and talking about Christmas plans that seemed to assume I'd be available to help with preparation, while Jessica would be expected to simply show up and enjoy herself. The food was delicious, as always. Mom had outdone herself with the turkey, and my sweet potato casserole had turned out perfectly. But eating from a dinosaur plate while sitting in a chair that made my knees bump against a folding table had a way of making even the best meal taste a little bitter. "Aunt Alex?" Tyler said, interrupting my brooding thoughts. "How come you don't have kids? Mom says you're really old now." The innocent question from an 8-year-old shouldn't have stung, but it did. Particularly the casual way he'd repeated what Jessica had apparently said about my age and life choices. "Well, buddy, sometimes grown-ups just have different kinds of lives. I have a job I really like, and I get to be the cool aunt who spoils. You instead. Do you think you'll ever get married? Mom says you're too picky." Another comment that had clearly been made in my absence, discussed as if my personal life was a family concern rather than, well, personal. "Maybe someday." Right now, I'm pretty happy with how things are." Tyler nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to him. "I think you should only marry someone who likes dinosaurs. That way you'd know they're cool." "That's excellent advice. I'll definitely keep that in mind." As the meal wound down and people began talking about dessert, I found myself really looking at my family with new eyes. These were people I loved, people I'd been prioritizing for my entire adult life. But somewhere along the way, they'd gotten comfortable with a version of me that didn't quite match reality. I was the helpful one, the available one, the one who could be counted on to handle logistics and cleanup, while others got to be the stars of the show. The realization wasn't angry exactly. It was more like finally seeing something that had been right in front of me for years. And with that clarity came a question I'd never thought to ask. What if they knew something about this house that I knew too? After dessert, when Tyler had been excused to play with his toys in the living room and the adults were settling into their post-meal coffee ritual, I started clearing the small folding table. The dinosaur plates clinked together as I stacked them, a sound that seemed oddly loud in the comfortable murmur of family conversation drifting from the dining room. "Alex, honey," Mom called from her seat at the real table. "When you're done with that, could you start on the dishes? Jessica and Carlos want to get Tyler home before it gets too late, and I'd love to visit with them a bit more before they go." The request was delivered with the same casual expectation that had defined my role in family gatherings for years. Not a question, really, but a polite instruction dressed up as a favor. I paused in my plate stacking, listening to Jessica laugh at something Uncle Paul had said, her voice bright and relaxed in the way that comes from being the center of positive attention. "Of course," I replied, because that's what I always said. But this time, something else came out of my mouth before I could stop it. "Actually, I was hoping to sit with everyone for coffee. I feel like I missed most of the conversation during dinner." The comment landed in the dining room like a pebble dropped into still water. Not dramatic, but creating ripples that reached every corner of the room. The laughter died down, and I could feel several pairs of eyes turning toward me. "Oh," Mom said, her tone shifting to something I couldn't quite identify. "Well, I suppose the dishes could wait a little while?" But the way she said it suggested that waiting was an inconvenience, and that my request was somehow unreasonable. I pulled out one of the empty chairs from against the wall and positioned it at the edge of the dining room table, between Sophie and the wall. It wasn't ideal placement, but it would allow me to actually participate in family conversation for once, instead of listening from the kitchen while I cleaned up after everyone else. Jessica glanced at her watch, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the family. "We really should think about heading out soon," she said to Carlos. "Tyler gets cranky when he stays up too late, and we have that early brunch tomorrow with my college friends." "Ah, just a few more minutes," Carlos replied, settling back into his chair. "This is nice. We don't get to do this very often." The irony wasn't lost on me. Carlos was talking about how rare and precious these family gatherings were, while Jessica was already planning their exit. Meanwhile, I'd been attending every single family holiday for 15 years, often arriving early to help and staying late to clean. And this was the first time I'd ever asked to simply sit and be part of the conversation. "So Alex," Aunt Maria said, clearly trying to smooth over the awkward moment, "tell us about work. Are you still doing the computer programming?" The question was well-intentioned, but revealed how little my family actually knew about what I did for a living. "Software development, yeah. I'm actually a senior engineer now, which means I lead a team of developers on major projects." "That sounds complicated," Uncle Paul said, the way people talk about hobbies they don't understand. "Do you enjoy it?" "I love it. We just launched a platform that helps small businesses manage their inventory and sales. It's been really rewarding to see how much it's helping people streamline their operations." I waited for follow-up questions, the kind Jessica always got when she talked about her marketing campaigns or Carlos got when he discussed his sales targets. Instead, There was a polite pause before Dad changed the subject to something he'd read about the Denver Broncos. The conversation moved on, flowing around me like water around a stone. Jessica and Carlos discussed their vacation plans for next year. Sophie talked about her graduate program in environmental science. Uncle Paul and Dad debated the merits of different snow tire brands. I contributed when I could, but mostly I observed, seeing the family dynamic from this new vantage point. What struck me wasn't that they were intentionally excluding me, but that they'd gotten so comfortable with my absence from these conversations that they'd forgotten to include me even when I was sitting right there. I was present, but peripheral, like background music that no one really notices until it stops playing. "Remember when Alex used to bring that awful guitar to family gatherings?" Jessica said suddenly, laughing at a memory from years ago. She was convinced she was going to be the next Taylor Swift or something. The comment stung more than it should have. I'd played guitar in college, had even written a few songs that I'd been proud of. I'd stopped bringing the guitar to family events after one too many jokes about my noise-making and suggestions that maybe dinner conversation was more appropriate than amateur concerts. "I wasn't that bad," I said mildly, trying to keep the defensiveness out of my voice. "No, you weren't," Mom agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that not everyone appreciates that kind of music during dinner." "What kind of music?" I asked, genuinely curious now. Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "You know, the sad singer-songwriter stuff. Very intense for a family gathering." I remembered those songs differently. They hadn't been particularly sad or intense, just personal in the way that original music tends to be. But apparently my family had experienced them as uncomfortable intrusions into their preferred atmosphere of light conversation and familiar jokes. "I still play sometimes," I said. "Just for myself now." "That's probably for the best," Dad said, and I could tell he thought he was being kind. Hobbies are great when they stay hobbies. The conversation moved on again, but I found myself stuck on that exchange. When had my family decided that my interests were hobbies to be tolerated rather than talents to be celebrated? When had they started viewing my contributions as intrusions rather than additions to our family culture? Tyler wandered back into the dining room, carrying a small plastic dinosaur and looking sleepy. "Mom, can we go home now? I'm tired." "Of course, sweetie," Jessica said, immediately shifting into mother mode. She stood up and began gathering their coats and Tyler's various toys scattered around the living room. "Thank you so much for dinner, Linda. Everything was absolutely perfect." The praise was genuine, and Mom beamed under the compliment. "Oh, you're so welcome. I love having everyone together like this." As the family began the prolonged process of saying goodbye, complete with multiple hugs and promises to get together, soon I started clearing the coffee cups from the dining room table. It wasn't something anyone had asked me to do, but 15 years of conditioning made it feel automatic. "Alex, you're such a help," Aunt Maria said, patting my shoulder as she handed me her empty cup. "Your parents are so lucky to have you." The comment was meant as praise, but it landed differently than she'd intended. Lucky to have me for what exactly? Lucky to have someone who would handle the logistics and cleanup while everyone else got to enjoy themselves? Lucky to have a family member who could be counted on to take care of practical matters without complaint. After Jessica, Carlos, and Tyler left, with promises to see everyone again at Christmas, the house felt oddly quiet. Uncle Paul and Aunt Maria stayed for another hour, helping to put away the good china and wrap up leftovers. Sophie offered to help with dishes, but Mom waved her off, saying I had it handled. By 7 o'clock, it was just me, Mom, and Dad in the house that suddenly felt much larger and quieter than it had all day. The kitchen was still a disaster, with pots and pans stacked in the sink and serving dishes covering every available counter surface. The dining room table was cleared but needed to be wiped down and reset for regular use. "What a lovely day," Mom said, settling into her favorite armchair in the living room with a satisfied sigh. It's so wonderful when the whole family can be together. I looked around at the chaos that would take at least 2 hours to clean up properly. It really was nice, I agreed, though I was starting to question what together actually meant in our family context. Dad had already claimed his recliner and was flipping through channels on the television, clearly settling in for an evening of relaxation. Alex, thanks for handling everything today. You really kept things running smoothly. Again, the praise felt backhanded. I'd kept things running smoothly by taking care of all the work that no one else wanted to do. But what would have happened if I hadn't been there? Would the dishes have done themselves? Would the table have magically reset itself for next time? No problem, I said, because that's what I always said. But as I headed back to the kitchen to tackle the mountain of dishes, I found myself wondering when I'd become the designated family caretaker and why everyone seemed so comfortable with that arrangement. The kitchen cleanup took exactly as long as I'd predicted. 2 full hours of washing serving dishes that were too large for the dishwasher, scrubbing pots with baked-on residue, and organizing leftovers into containers that Mom would probably forget about until they went bad. By the time I finished, my back ached and my hands were raw from hot water and dish soap. Mom and Dad had fallen asleep in their chairs, the television playing quietly in the background. I covered them with the throw blankets from the couch and turned off the lights, then gathered my coat and purse from the front closet. The drive home to my apartment took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet I usually enjoyed after family gatherings. This time, instead of feeling satisfied by a day well spent with people I loved, I felt oddly hollow, as if something important had been missing from the entire experience. Back in my own space, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on my small balcony despite the November chill. My apartment wasn't large or fancy, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by me. Every decoration reflected my taste. Every book on the shelves represented my interests and curiosities. It was a space where I could play guitar without worrying about disturbing anyone, where I could cook elaborate meals for myself without having to coordinate with other people's preferences, where I could exist without constantly considering how my presence affected everyone else. For the first time, I wondered if this small apartment actually felt more like home than the house where I'd spent every major holiday for the past 15 years. The realization was unsettling in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Thanksgiving dinner more than usual. Not the food or the family time, but the specific dynamics I'd observed when I'd finally sat down at the adult table. The way conversation flowed around certain people and past others. The way some family members' accomplishments were celebrated, while others were barely acknowledged. The way certain voices were heard and valued while others were background noise. I started paying attention to other family interactions with new awareness. When Jessica called Mom to chat about her work drama, Mom listened for 45 minutes and offered advice and emotional support. When I called to mention my promotion, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes and included suggestions that I shouldn't let success go to my head. When Carlos needed help moving furniture, Uncle Paul and Dad showed up with trucks and spent a Saturday helping out. When I'd moved apartments 2 years ago, I'd hired movers because no one had offered to help. And when I'd mentioned how expensive it was, Dad had suggested I should have thought about that before choosing to move. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Within our family system, some people were seen as deserving of support, attention, and celebration, while others were seen as sources of support for everyone else. And I was definitely in the second category. The truly disturbing part wasn't that this hierarchy existed, but that it had become so normalized that no one seemed to notice it anymore, including me, until now. I started doing something I'd never done before, keeping track of family interactions. Not obsessively, just mentally, noting who called whom, who offered help to whom, who celebrated whose achievements. The pattern that emerged was stark and undeniable. Jessica called Mom twice a week, usually to talk about her problems or share good news. Mom called me when she needed something researched online, when she had computer problems, or when she wanted help planning family events. Dad texted Jessica photos of his woodworking projects and asked for her opinion on color choices. He texted me reminders about family birthdays and requests to pick up specific items when I was coming over. Uncle Paul and Carlos had developed a friendship that extended beyond family gatherings, bonding over shared interests in hunting and sports. When Uncle Paul needed help with home repairs, Carlos was always willing to lend a hand. When Carlos wanted advice about career moves, Uncle Paul was someone he could turn to for perspective. Sophie and Jessica had grown closer in recent years, with Jessica taking on an almost mentoring role in Sophie's life. They texted regularly, met for coffee when Sophie was in town, and Jessica had even helped Sophie prepare for job interviews. And then there was me. I received communications when people needed something and sent communications when I was offering something. The reciprocity that characterized everyone else's relationships was notably absent from mine. The realization crystallized during a phone call with Mom 3 days after Thanksgiving. She called while I was at work during a brief break between meetings to ask if I could research vacation rentals for the family Christmas gathering she was planning. "I know you're good at finding deals online," she said, "and you have more time to look into these things properly." I did have research skills, and I didn't mind helping with family planning, but the assumption that I had more time than everyone else was interesting. I worked 50 hours a week at a demanding job that required constant learning and problem solving. Jessica worked 40 hours at a job she frequently described as laid back and social. Carlos had flexible scheduling that allowed him to take long lunch breaks and leave early on Fridays. Yet somehow I was the one presumed to have extra time for family logistics. "What kind of budget are we working with?" I asked, pulling up vacation rental websites on my computer. "Well, if everyone contributes equally, we could probably manage something really nice." Jessica and Carlos are excited about the idea of skiing, and Tyler would love a place with a hot tub. I started calculating in my head. A vacation rental that could accommodate our extended family during Christmas week in a ski area with amenities like a hot tub would easily cost several $1,000. Divided equally among the adults, that would be a significant expense, especially right after the holidays. "That sounds expensive," I said carefully. "Have you talked to everyone about what they're comfortable spending?" "Oh, you know how these things work out," Mom said vaguely. "We'll figure out the details once we find the right place." I had a sinking feeling that figuring out the details would involve me paying a disproportionate share while everyone else contributed what they could afford. It was a pattern that had developed over years of family trips and shared expenses, so gradual that I'd barely noticed it happening. But now I was noticing everything. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I made a spreadsheet. Not because I'm naturally obsessive about record keeping, but because I needed to see the reality of our family's financial dynamics laid out in black and white. I went through my bank statements and credit card records for the past 3 years, categorizing every expense related to family events, gifts, and shared costs. The numbers were shocking, even to me. Family birthday gifts. I averaged $150 per person per year, while receiving gifts that averaged about $40. Family vacation contributions. I typically paid 35–40% of shared expenses despite being only one of 6 adults. Holiday meal contributions. I brought expensive items like wine and specialty ingredients, while others brought items like bread or soda. But the most revealing category was what I started calling emergency assistance. Over 3 years, I'd provided financial help to family members totaling over $8,000. A loan to help Jessica with her car repair that was never repaid. Money for Tyler's summer camp when Carlos was between jobs. Contribution to Uncle Paul's medical bills when his insurance didn't cover everything. None of these were large amounts individually, and I'd given them freely without expecting repayment. But seeing them added up, I realized I'd become the family's unofficial bank, the person everyone turned to when they needed financial help, but no one thought to include when they were celebrating financial success. The spreadsheet revealed something else that was even more disturbing. The emotional labor I'd been providing was just as one-sided as the financial support. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, organized group gifts for special occasions, researched family vacation options, and coordinated holiday schedules. I was the family's administrative assistant, accountant, and emotional support system all rolled into one. And everyone had gotten so comfortable with these services that they'd stopped seeing them as generous contributions and started viewing them as my natural role in the family ecosystem. Looking at those numbers, I finally understood why I'd felt so hollow after Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't just about sitting at the kids' table. It was about being treated like a child while simultaneously being expected to handle adult responsibilities that no one else wanted to take on. I was 35 years old, financially stable, professionally successful, and emotionally mature. But in my family's eyes, I was still the helpful younger family member whose primary value was in what I could do for everyone else, rather than who I was as a person. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether this dynamic was fair. It obviously wasn't. The question was whether it was fixable, or whether it had become so entrenched in our family culture that challenging it would require more energy than I was willing to invest. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I kept thinking about Tyler's innocent question at the dinner table. How come the grown-ups didn't want to sit with us? He'd understood something that I'd been too close to see clearly. The seating arrangement hadn't been about practicality or space constraints. It had been about status and value. And if an 8-year-old could see it, maybe it was time for me to stop pretending it wasn't happening. The week after Thanksgiving, Jessica called with a crisis that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. Her voice was tight with stress when she reached me at work on Wednesday afternoon, interrupting a meeting I'd been leading about our upcoming product launch. "Alex, thank God you answered," she said, barely giving me time to say hello. "I'm in complete panic mode here. Carlos got laid off yesterday, and we just found out Tyler's private school is raising tuition by 30% for next semester. I don't know what we're going to do." I stepped out of the meeting room, signaling to my team that I'd be right back. "I'm so sorry, Jess. That's terrible timing with the holidays coming up." "It gets worse," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "We already paid the deposit for that Cancun trip I told everyone about at Thanksgiving. It was supposed to be non-refundable, but I called and begged them to let us cancel. They said the best they can do is give us a credit, but we lose 20% of what we paid." I could hear Tyler chattering in the background, blissfully unaware of his parents' financial stress. Jessica had always been good at shielding him from adult worries, something I admired about her parenting style. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad about this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "That's actually why I'm calling you," Jessica said, confirming my suspicion. "You know how Dad gets about money stuff. He'll want to give us this whole lecture about emergency funds and responsible spending, and Mom will just worry herself sick. I was hoping maybe you could help us figure out a solution before we have to involve them." This was familiar territory. For years, I'd been the family member people called when they needed financial advice or assistance, precisely because I didn't lecture or judge or make people feel guilty about their circumstances. I just helped solve problems. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" I asked, already mentally calculating my own finances and how much I could potentially lend them without putting myself in a difficult position. "The school tuition is due in 2 weeks," Jessica said. "That's about $4,000 for the semester. And honestly, even if Carlos finds something quickly, it'll probably take a month or 2 before he's getting regular paychecks again. We've got maybe 6 weeks of expenses saved up, but that's cutting it really close." $4,000 was a significant amount, but not impossible for me to manage. I'd been saving steadily for years, initially for a house down payment, but more recently, just because I'd gotten into the habit of living below my means. My software engineering salary afforded me a comfortable lifestyle without requiring me to spend everything I earned. "Let me think about this," I said. "I might be able to help with the tuition, at least as a loan until Carlos gets back on his feet." The relief in Jessica's voice was immediate and overwhelming. "Alex, you would be a lifesaver. Literally." I was lying awake all night trying to figure out how we were going to make this work. "Just give me a day to look at my finances and figure out the best way to handle it," I said. "I'll call you tomorrow with a plan." After I hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes before going back into the meeting. This wasn't the first time I'd been asked to help with a family financial crisis, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But something about the conversation bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't Jessica's request for help. That felt reasonable given the circumstances. It wasn't even the assumption that I would be able and willing to assist. Over the years, I'd established myself as someone family members could turn to when they needed financial support. What bothered me was the automatic assumption that I should handle this quietly, without involving our parents or other family members who might also be in a position to help. The implication seemed to be that my money was somehow more available, or less important than everyone else's. That evening, I sat down with my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I researched the actual cost of Tyler's private school. What I found was illuminating and disturbing in equal measure. Tyler attended Maple Ridge Academy, one of the most expensive private schools in our area. Annual tuition was nearly $16,000, not including fees for activities, supplies, and other extras. For comparison, the public schools in their district were actually quite good, with test scores and college admission rates that competed favorably with many private institutions. Jessica and Carlos had chosen private school for Tyler not because the public options were inadequate, but because they wanted him to have what Jessica called the best possible start in life. It was a choice that reflected their values and priorities, which I respected. But it was interesting that when the cost of that choice became difficult to manage, the solution involved asking me to subsidize it, rather than reconsidering whether it was financially sustainable. I spent the next hour looking at my own financial situation with new eyes. The spreadsheet I'd created after Thanksgiving had shown me how much I'd been contributing to family expenses over the years, but I hadn't really considered what I could have done with that money if I'd kept it for myself. $8,000 in emergency assistance over 3 years, plus the consistent overpayment on shared family expenses, plus the expensive gifts and contributions to family events. If I'd put all of that money into savings instead, I'd be significantly closer to having enough for a house down payment. The realization hit me like cold water. I'd been subsidizing other people's lifestyle choices while delaying my own major life goals. Not intentionally, and not because anyone had asked me to make that trade-off, but because I'd gotten into a pattern of saying yes to requests for help without considering the cumulative impact on my own financial planning. The next morning, I called Jessica back with what I thought was a reasonable proposal. I could lend them the $4,000 for Tyler's tuition, but I wanted to set up a formal repayment schedule rather than leaving it as an open-ended loan like I'd done in the past. "That's totally fair," Jessica agreed immediately. "What were you thinking for timeline? Maybe $200 a month once Carlos finds a new job? That would have it paid off in about 2 years, and it's manageable without putting strain on your regular budget." "Perfect. Alex, you're honestly the best sister anyone could ask for. I don't know how we got so lucky." But as I prepared to transfer the money from my savings account, something made me pause. Lucky how exactly? Lucky to have a family member who was willing and able to provide financial assistance when needed? Or lucky to have someone who could be counted on to solve problems without expecting anything in return? I realized I didn't actually know the answer to that question. Did Jessica see me as generous or as useful? Did the family value me for who I was, or for what I could provide? The distinction mattered more than I'd previously understood. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention to how money moved within our family system. Not obsessively, but with the kind of awareness that comes from finally seeing a pattern you'd been unconsciously participating in for years. When Uncle Paul needed help with unexpected veterinary bills for his dog, he mentioned it casually during a family phone call. Within days, he'd received offers of assistance from multiple family members, including Mom and Dad, who organized a group contribution that meant no single person had to provide a large amount. When Sophie needed help with graduate school expenses, it became a family project. Everyone contributed what they could, and the family treated it as an investment in her education that would benefit everyone in the long run. There were family meetings to discuss the budget, regular check-ins about her progress, and celebration when she achieved academic milestones. But when I'd provided financial assistance to family members, it had always been handled as private transactions between me and the person who needed help. No family meetings, no group contributions, no shared celebration when the crisis was resolved. Just quiet assistance that allowed everyone else to maintain their lifestyle without having to make difficult choices or sacrifices. The pattern became impossible to ignore during Christmas planning. Mom called in early December to discuss the vacation rental she'd asked me to research weeks earlier. "I found some beautiful places," she said, "but they're all pretty expensive for Christmas week. The one that can accommodate everyone is about $6,000 for 4 nights. I did quick math in my head. 6 adults plus Tyler, divided 7 ways, would be about $850 per person. That was steep, but not impossible, especially for a special family Christmas vacation. "Have you talked to everyone about the budget?" I asked. "Well, that's the thing," Mom said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "Jessica and Carlos are still dealing with his job situation, so they can't really contribute much right now. And Sophie is a student, so we can't expect her to pay the same amount as everyone else. Uncle Paul and Maria said they could probably manage $300 or $400, but not much more than that." I was beginning to see where this conversation was headed. "So what are you thinking for the breakdown?" "Your father and I could probably handle about $1,500, Mom said, "and I was hoping you might be able to cover the rest. I know it's a lot, but you're the only one who's really in a position to make this work for everyone." The rest. After everyone else's contributions, the rest would be about $3,500. More than half the total cost for a vacation that had been planned around other people's preferences and schedules. "Mom, that's a huge amount for me to cover by myself," I said carefully. "I know, sweetie, and I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. But you know how important these family times are, especially now that Tyler's getting older and won't want to spend Christmas with the boring grown-ups much longer." The guilt was subtle, but effective. If I said no, I would be the reason the family couldn't have a special Christmas together. If I said yes, I would be financially responsible for everyone else's vacation, while having no more input into the planning than anyone else. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course, but I do need to book something soon if we want to get a good place." After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hands for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When had I become the family's backup financial plan? When had my willingness to help in emergencies transformed into an expectation that I would fund everyone else's lifestyle choices? I thought about Jessica's comment from Thanksgiving, when she'd said I was lucky to have all that free time because I didn't have a family of my own. At the time, it had stung because it dismissed the demands of my job and my own life responsibilities. But now I was seeing a more insidious implication. In my family's eyes, my money was somehow more available than theirs because I didn't have children to support. My time was more expendable because I didn't have a spouse to consider. My priorities were less important because they only affected me rather than a family unit. The assumption seemed to be that single people, by virtue of being single, had fewer legitimate claims on their own resources and should therefore be more willing to share those resources with family members who had real responsibilities. It was a logic that made a certain sense from the outside, but felt increasingly problematic when I was the one being asked to live by it. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I calculated exactly how much the Christmas vacation would cost me relative to my income, and compared it to what it would cost other family members relative to theirs. The numbers were stark. The $3,500 I was being asked to contribute represented about 12% of my annual take-home pay. For Uncle Paul and Aunt Maria, their $400 contribution represented less than 2% of their combined income. For my parents, their $2,500 represented about 4% of Dad's pension and Mom's Social Security. Everyone else was being asked to contribute an amount that would be barely noticeable in their monthly budget. I was being asked to contribute an amount that would require me to adjust my own vacation plans, delay other purchases, and dip into savings I'd been accumulating for my own future goals. But the most revealing calculation was the one I did for Jessica and Carlos. Even with Carlos unemployed, their household income for the previous year had been higher than mine. They'd chosen to live in a more expensive house, drive newer cars, and send Tyler to private school. Those were all reasonable choices, but they were choices that had financial consequences. Now, instead of adjusting their lifestyle to accommodate Carlos's job loss, they were expecting me to subsidize their continuation of that lifestyle while they got back on their feet. And the family was treating this as reasonable and appropriate, rather than as a significant sacrifice on my part. I started thinking about other examples of this dynamic playing out over the years. When Jessica and Carlos had bought their house, they'd chosen a mortgage payment that stretched their budget because they deserved to live in a nice neighborhood. When they'd needed help with the down payment, I'd provided it as a gift rather than a loan because I wanted to support their dream of homeownership. When they'd wanted to take that expensive vacation to Cancun, they'd justified it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience that Tyler would remember forever. When the vacation became financially stressful, I'd been asked to help with the school tuition so they wouldn't have to cancel their trip. When Uncle Paul had wanted to buy a new truck, he'd financed it at a high interest rate because his credit wasn't great. When the payments became difficult to manage along with his other expenses, I'd helped with a few months of payments as a temporary assistance that had never been repaid. The pattern was always the same. Family members made lifestyle choices based on what they wanted, rather than what they could comfortably afford, and when those choices created financial stress, I was expected to help them maintain their preferred lifestyle rather than suggesting they adjust their expectations to match their resources. Meanwhile, I'd been living conservatively, saving money, avoiding debt, and making financial decisions based on what I could afford rather than what I wanted. The reward for this responsible approach seemed to be that I got to subsidize everyone else's less responsible choices. The irony was that if I lived the way other family members lived, spending everything I earned and financing lifestyle choices I couldn't quite afford, I wouldn't be in a position to help anyone when they needed it. My usefulness to the family was directly dependent on maintaining a financial discipline that no one else seemed expected to exercise. It was a system that worked well for everyone except me. The breaking point came during a family group text thread about Christmas vacation planning. Jessica had shared photos of the rental property Mom had found, and everyone was enthusiastic about the hot tub, the mountain views, and the proximity to ski slopes. "This looks amazing," Sophie wrote. "I can't wait to try skiing for the first time." "Tyler is going to love that game room," Carlos added. "Thanks for finding such a perfect place, Linda." "Alex, you're the best for making this possible," Jessica chimed in. "We're so grateful you can handle the lion's share of the cost." I stared at that message for a long time, grateful that I could handle it. Not grateful that I was choosing to handle it, but grateful that I was capable of handling it. As if my financial contribution was as inevitable as the weather rather than a significant sacrifice I was making for everyone else's benefit. That's when I realized that somewhere along the way, my family had stopped seeing my generosity as generosity They'd started seeing it as my function within the family system. I wasn't Alex, who happened to be helpful with money. I was the family member whose role was to be helpful with money. The distinction mattered because generosity requires choice. When help becomes expected rather than appreciated, when assistance becomes obligation rather than gift, it stops being generosity and becomes something else entirely. I'd become the family's financial safety net without anyone, including me, explicitly acknowledging that's what had happened. And safety nets, by definition, are only valuable when they're needed. The rest of the time, they're just infrastructure that people take for granted. Sitting in my apartment that evening, looking at the group text messages full of excitement about a vacation I was paying for but hadn't helped plan, I finally understood why I'd felt so hollow after Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't just about sitting at the kids' table. It was about being treated like someone whose primary value was in what she could provide rather than who she was as a person. Someone whose preferences didn't need to be consulted as long as her resources were available. Someone whose contributions could be taken for granted because they'd become part of the expected family infrastructure. I'd spent years trying to earn my place at the adult table through usefulness, only to discover that usefulness was a trap that kept me from ever being seen as an equal rather than a service provider. The question now was whether I was brave, enough to stop providing those services long enough to find out what kind of relationship my family actually wanted with me when I wasn't solving their problems and funding their dreams. The answer to that question would determine everything that happened next. The decision to stop participating in the Christmas vacation came to me gradually, then all at once. I'd been staring at my laptop screen for 20 minutes, cursor blinking, in the reply field of the family group text, trying to figure out how to express what I was feeling without sounding petty or unreasonable. But every draft I wrote either sounded angry or apologetic, and I wasn't feeling either of those things. I was feeling something much more dangerous. Clarity. Instead of responding to the group text, I called Mom directly. She answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and distracted. "Hi, sweetie. I was just looking at ski rental prices for the vacation. Did you see Jessica's messages about the house? Isn't it perfect?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, settling into my desk chair and opening the folder where I'd been keeping financial records. "I've been thinking about the budget breakdown, and I don't think I can contribute $3,500 to the vacation." There was a pause, longer than I'd expected. "Oh, well, what amount were you thinking? Maybe we could find something a little less expensive. Actually, I was thinking more like $850. You know, if we split the cost equally among all 7 of us." Another pause. This one weighted with something I couldn't identify. "Alex, honey, you know that's not realistic. Jessica and Carlos are dealing with his job situation, and Sophie is still a student. We have to be flexible about these things." But why does being flexible always mean I pay more? The question came out more directly than I'd intended, but I didn't try to soften it. That's not how we think about it," Mom said, though her tone suggested she was reconsidering that assumption in real time. "It's just that you're in a better position to help right now." "Am I, though?" I pulled up the spreadsheet I'd been working on. "Mom, over the past 3 years, I've contributed over $12,000 to family expenses and emergencies beyond my equal share. That's not including gifts or normal holiday contributions. That's just the extra amount I've paid because other people couldn't or wouldn't pay their fair share." "I don't think anyone's been keeping track like that," Mom said. And I could hear disapproval creeping into her voice. "We're family. We help each other out when we can. You're right. We should help each other. But that's not what's been happening. I've been helping everyone else, and no one has been helping me." "What do you need help with? You're doing well financially, you have a good job, you don't have the same responsibilities as Jessica and Carlos." There it was again. The assumption that my financial stability somehow obligated me to subsidize everyone else's choices. "Mom, the reason I'm doing well financially is because I live within my means and save money instead of spending everything I earn. But when I use those savings to help family members, I'm delaying my own goals. I want to buy a house someday, but I can't save for a down payment if I'm constantly covering other people's expenses. A house? Mom sounded genuinely surprised. You never mentioned wanting to buy a house. I've mentioned it several times, actually, but every time I bring up my long-term financial goals, the conversation changes to something else. I could hear Mom moving around, probably tidying something while she processed this information. Well, if buying a house is important to you, maybe you should prioritize that over expensive family vacations. The comment landed exactly wrong. That's what I'm trying to do, Mom. I'm trying to prioritize my own financial goals instead of automatically saying yes every time someone needs money. I think you're overreacting, she said, her tone shifting to something more familiar. No one is forcing you to help with family expenses. You offer because you want to help. Do I, though? Or do I offer because I know what happens when I don't? What's that supposed to mean? I took a deep breath, realizing I was about to say something that would change our relationship permanently. It means that when I don't immediately agree to help with money, I get guilt trips about family loyalty and how important these events are for everyone. It means that my financial contributions are treated as more available than everyone else's because I'm single and don't have kids. It means that I'm expected to be grateful for the opportunity to fund everyone else's lifestyle choices. Alex, that's not fair. We don't think about it that way. Maybe not consciously, but that's how it works in practice. Jessica calls me when she needs help with Tyler's tuition, instead of calling you because she knows I won't lecture her about financial responsibility. You ask me to research vacation rentals because I have more time, even though I work more hours than most of the family. Everyone assumes I can afford to contribute more because I don't have a family of my own, as if my money is somehow less important than theirs. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice careful and controlled. I think you've been building up resentment for a long time, and now it's all coming out, at once. Maybe you should think about whether this is really about money or about something else. The suggestion that my concerns weren't valid, that they were just displaced emotions about something else, was exactly the kind of dismissal I'd been experiencing for years. It's about respect, Mom. It's about being seen as an equal member of this family instead of just a resource to be tapped when needed. Of course you're an equal member of the family. What a terrible thing to say. Then why was I seated at the kids' table on Thanksgiving? The question hung in the air like smoke. I hadn't planned to bring up Thanksgiving, but there it was. The incident that had started me questioning everything about my role in the family. That was about space constraints, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tyler needed supervision, and you're so good with kids. There were 8 chairs and 9 people, Mom. Someone had to sit at the kids' table, but why was it automatically me? Why not Jessica or Carlos or Sophie? Why is the 35-year-old with a successful career the one who gets relegated to the children's area? You're reading too much into a seating arrangement. Am I? Because from where I was sitting, it felt like a pretty clear message about where I rank in this family's hierarchy. Another long pause. When Mom spoke again, her tone had shifted to something more defensive. I think you're being very unfair right now. We love you, Alex. We appreciate everything you do for the family. What you appreciate is what I do. I'm not sure you actually see who I am. That's ridiculous. Is it? When was the last time someone in this family asked about my life without needing something? When was the last time anyone celebrated my achievements or asked for my opinion on something that didn't involve solving a problem for someone else? I could hear Mom breathing on the other end of the line, but she didn't answer immediately. The silence was answer enough. I'm not going to contribute $3,500 to the Christmas vacation, I said finally. If everyone wants to do equal shares, I'm happy to pay $850. If that doesn't work for the family budget, then maybe we need to choose a less expensive option or skip the vacation this year. Alex, please don't do this. Don't ruin Christmas for everyone because you're upset about money. I'm not ruining anything, Mom. I'm just not paying for everyone else's Christmas anymore. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than I had in years. Lighter because I'd finally said things that needed to be said. Heavier because I knew there would be consequences, and not just financial ones. The family group text thread went silent after Mom presumably shared the news of my reduced contribution. No one argued with me directly, but no one supported my position either. Instead, the conversation shifted to alternative vacation options that would work with a smaller budget. Jessica called me 2 days later, her voice carefully controlled in a way that meant she was trying not to lose her temper. Mom told me, "About your conversation regarding Christmas," she said. "I have to say, I'm pretty surprised by your attitude." "What attitude is that?" "This whole thing about keeping score of who pays for what. That's not how family works, Alex." "How does family work then? Because from my perspective, it's been working pretty well for everyone except me." "That's not true. Everyone contributes what they can when they can. Remember when Carlos helped Dad move all that furniture from the basement? Remember when I organized Mom's entire kitchen renovation? We all pitch in different ways." "You're right. Everyone contributes differently. But financial contributions are different from helping with projects or organizing events. When I give someone money, I can't get that money back to use for my own needs. When Carlos helps Dad move furniture, he still has his full paycheck at the end of the day." "So you're saying our time and effort don't count as real contributions?" "I'm saying that if I want to buy a house someday, I need to save money. I can't save money if I'm constantly using my savings to subsidize other people's lifestyle choices." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "You know what this sounds like? It sounds like you resent the fact that Carlos and I have a family, and you don't." The comment hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me? I think you're jealous of what we have, and you're using money as a way to punish us for having the life you want." I had to take several deep breaths before responding. "Jessica, that's incredibly cruel and completely wrong. I'm not jealous of your life. I'm tired of subsidizing it." "Nobody asked you to subsidize anything. You offered to help with Tyler's tuition. You've always been generous with family expenses. If you didn't want to help, you should have said so instead of building up resentment." "I did want to help, but wanting to help occasionally is different from being expected to help constantly. And there's a difference between being asked to help and being told that I'm the only one who can afford to make family events possible." "Well, maybe if you had your own family responsibilities, you'd understand why the rest of us can't always contribute equally to everything." There it was again, the suggestion that my life was somehow less legitimate because I didn't have children. My life has value even if I don't have kids, Jessica. My goals matter even if they only affect me. My money is just as important to my future as yours is to Tyler's. I never said your life doesn't have value. You just said I should understand why everyone else's financial obligations are more important than mine. Jessica sighed heavily. "Look, I don't want to fight about this, but I think you're being really unfair to people who love you and have always treated you like family." "How exactly have you always treated me like family?" "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one. Because family members usually get consulted about major decisions, not just asked to fund them. Family members get equal consideration, not relegated to kids' tables. Family members celebrate each other's successes, instead of treating them like hobbies that don't matter." "Alex, you're really twisting things around here." "Am I?" "Tell me about my job, Jessica. What do I do for work?" "You work with computers." "That's like saying you work with people. I'm a senior software engineer leading a team of developers. I just got promoted to technical lead on a project that's being used by thousands of small businesses." But you don't know that because no one ever asks for details about my work beyond how are things going. Okay, I'm sorry I don't know all the specifics of your job. It's not about the specifics. It's about the fact that when you talk about your marketing campaigns, everyone listens and asks follow-up questions and celebrates your successes. When I talk about my work, people change the subject. That's not true. At Thanksgiving dinner, when I mentioned getting promoted to senior engineer, Dad changed the subject to the Denver Broncos within 30 seconds. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Maybe people don't understand your work well enough to ask good questions about it. Then maybe they should try to learn, the way I've learned about marketing and sales and elementary education and all the other things family members do for work. You're really determined to make us all sound terrible, aren't you? I'm not trying to make anyone sound terrible. I'm trying to explain why I can't keep functioning as the family's backup financial plan while being treated like my own life doesn't matter. Your life does matter, Alex. But so do other people's lives. So does Tyler's education. So do family traditions that bring us all together. You're right, those things matter. But they matter to everyone, not just to me. If Tyler's education is important to the whole family, then the whole family should contribute to supporting it. If family traditions are valuable to everyone, then everyone should be equally invested in making them happen. Some people just aren't in a position to contribute equally. And some people are tired of being in the position of always contributing more. The conversation ended without resolution, with Jessica saying she needed to think about what I'd said and me feeling exhausted by the entire exchange. But something had shifted, and I could feel it in the days that followed. The family group text thread, which had been active multiple times per week for years, went almost completely quiet. When messages did appear, they were purely logistical, without the casual banter and shared jokes that had made me feel connected to everyone's daily lives. Mom called once, ostensibly to ask about a computer problem she was having, but the conversation felt strained and formal. She didn't mention Christmas vacation or our previous conversation, and neither did I. Uncle Paul texted to ask if I wanted to join him for coffee, something he'd never done before. When we met, he spent most of the time talking about family dynamics and how sometimes people need space to work through their feelings. It felt like an intervention disguised as casual conversation. The isolation was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't being punished exactly, but I was definitely being treated differently. The family was giving me space to come to my senses and return to my previous role as helpful contributor and problem solver. What they didn't understand was that the space was exactly what I needed to gain perspective on how drastically my life changed when I wasn't constantly managing other people's crises and funding their choices. For the first time in years, I had entire weekends with no family obligations, no research to do for someone else's vacation planning, no financial emergencies to solve, no logistics to coordinate or problems to troubleshoot. The quiet was initially unsettling, then gradually liberating. I started taking pottery classes on Saturday mornings. I joined a hiking group that met every Sunday. I began cooking elaborate meals for myself without having to consider anyone else's dietary preferences or schedule constraints. Most importantly, I started saving money at a rate that shocked me. Without the constant drain of family financial contributions, my savings account grew by more in 6 weeks than it had in the previous 6 months. I was finally living my own life instead of serving as supporting cast in everyone else's. The breakthrough came on a cold February morning when I was reviewing mortgage pre-approval documents. I'd been working with a realtor for several weeks, looking at houses in my price range, and had finally found one that felt like home. A small 2-bedroom craftsman with original hardwood floors, a renovated kitchen, and a backyard perfect for the garden I'd always wanted to plant. I was scheduled to make an offer that afternoon when my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Alex, thank God." "You answered," she said. her voice tight with stress. "We have a huge problem, and I really need your help." The familiar phrase triggered something in me, not anger exactly, but a kind of amused recognition. "What's going on?" "Carlos got a job offer, which is great news, but it's in Phoenix. We'd have to move by the end of March. The relocation package covers most of the moving expenses, but we need to break our lease early, and that's going to cost us about $4,000 in penalties." I looked at the mortgage documents spread across my kitchen table, then at the photos of the house I was planning to buy. That's a tough situation. I know it's a lot to ask, especially after everything that happened around Christmas, but you're the only person we know who might be able to help with this amount on short notice. There it was again. The assumption that my money was more available than anyone else's, that my financial priorities were less important than their immediate needs. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad about this?" "They're already stretched thin, helping us with other moving expenses. And honestly, after the way you left things at Christmas, I wasn't sure you'd be willing to help, but I figured I had to ask. The way I left things, as if I had been the one who created conflict rather than simply declining to overpay for a vacation I hadn't helped plan." "Jessica, I'm actually in the process of buying a house. I'm supposed to make an offer this afternoon." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd heard me. "You're buying a house? When did you decide to do that?" "I've been thinking about it for years. I finally have enough saved for a down payment." "Oh, well, congratulations, I guess. That's really exciting." But her tone suggested it was anything but exciting to her. It was inconvenient, because it meant I couldn't solve her current problem. "I'm sure you'll figure out the lease situation," I said. "Maybe Carlos's new company can help with those costs as part of the relocation package." "We already asked about that. They said the package only covers certain types of expenses." "What about a personal loan from the bank?" "Our credit took a hit during Carlos's unemployment. The interest rates they're offering are pretty brutal." I could feel the conversation heading toward an explicit request for money, the same pattern that had played out dozens of times over the years. But this time, something was different. This time, I had a clear alternative use for my money that mattered more to me than solving someone else's problem. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this stress," I said, and I meant it. "But I'm not going to be able to help financially. My savings are committed to the house purchase." "Alex, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. This job is a huge opportunity for Carlos. The salary increase will more than make up for the lease penalties within the first year." "That's great. It sounds like a smart long-term move for your family." "But we can't take the job if we can't afford to break the lease. Then maybe you need to negotiate with the landlord or find another solution. I'm sure there are options that don't involve me lending you money." "There aren't, though. We've already explored everything else." I doubted that was true, but it didn't matter. "Jessica, for years I've been the family's solution to financial problems. Every time someone needed money, I provided it. But that meant I never had the chance to use my money for my own goals. This would just be temporary. We'd pay you back as soon as we get settled in Phoenix." That's what everyone always says. But temporary loans have a way of becoming permanent gifts, and I can't afford to give away $4,000 right now. "So, you're going to let us miss out on this opportunity because you want to buy a house?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how Jessica viewed the situation. My goal of homeownership was just a want, while her need to break a lease was a legitimate emergency that should take priority. I'm going to prioritize my own financial goals for once, instead of automatically sacrificing them to solve other people's problems. That's really selfish, Alex. Is it? Or is it healthy boundary setting that I should have done years ago? It's selfish. We're family. Family helps each other. You're right. Family should help each other. But helping shouldn't be a one-way street, and it shouldn't require one person to constantly sacrifice their own goals for everyone else's benefit. When have we not helped you? Name one time you needed something and we weren't there for you. The challenge hung in the air. and I realized she genuinely couldn't think of examples of the family helping me because they'd never been asked to. I'd been so conditioned to be the helper that I'd never asked for help in return. The difference is that I've never asked, I said finally. I've never asked you to research vacation rentals for me, or lend me money for major purchases, or help me solve logistical problems. I've never asked because I learned early that my role in this family was to provide assistance, not to receive it. That's not true. When I was looking for apartments 3 years ago, did anyone offer to help me with the security deposit? You never said you needed help. When I was working 80-hour weeks on that major project last year, did anyone offer to help with my grocery shopping or cleaning so I could manage the workload? You seemed like you had everything under control. When I got promoted to senior engineer, did anyone suggest we celebrate with a family dinner? Jessica was quiet for a moment. I don't remember you mentioning the promotion. I mentioned it at Thanksgiving. The conversation lasted about 30 seconds before Dad changed the subject to football. Maybe people just don't know how to celebrate work achievements that they don't understand. Then maybe they should make an effort to understand the way I've made an effort to understand everyone else's jobs and interests and challenges. Alex, I think you're really overanalyzing family dynamics that are just normal variations in how people relate to each other. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally seeing clearly how this family actually works, and I'm deciding I don't want to participate in those dynamics anymore. What does that mean? It means I'm buying a house with my savings instead of lending money to family members. It means I'm going to start celebrating my own achievements instead of waiting for other people to notice them. It means I'm going to stop being available to solve everyone else's problems so I can focus on my own goals. You're really going to punish the whole family because you're upset about some perceived slight. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just not rescuing anyone either. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table looking at the mortgage documents and the photos of the house I wanted to buy. For the first time in years, I was about to make a major life decision based purely on what I wanted rather than on what other people needed from me. The house was perfect. Not large or luxurious, but perfect for me. A place where I could play guitar without worrying about disturbing anyone, where I could cook elaborate meals without having to coordinate with other people's schedules, where I could exist without constantly considering how my choices affected everyone else. I called my realtor and told her I was ready to make an offer. 3 weeks later, I was sitting on the front porch of my new house, drinking coffee from my favorite mug, and watching the sun come up over my own backyard. The silence was profound and peaceful, broken only by birds and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Heard about the house from Jessica. Congratulations. We'd love to see it sometime. I read the message twice, trying to parse the tone. It felt tentative, almost apologetic, though it didn't include an actual apology. I typed back, "Thank you. You're welcome anytime." It wasn't an invitation exactly, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a boundary, clearly stated but not unkindly enforced. They could visit my house, but they would be guests in my space rather than me being a supporting player in their activities. Over the following months, I established a new relationship with my family based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. I attended family events when I wanted to and declined when I had other priorities. I contributed equally to shared expenses and nothing more. I celebrated my own achievements whether or not anyone else acknowledged them. The adjustment period was sometimes uncomfortable. My father had been paying the insurance on my house for 15 years, managing the policy as if he owned the property, making claims and decisions without ever mentioning it to me. The property tax records revealed a similar pattern. Annual high payments made from an account in my parents' names, with all correspondence sent to their address rather than mine. They'd been handling every aspect of property ownership except the one thing that actually mattered, acknowledging that I was the owner. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls, slowly unraveling the web of assumptions and arrangements that had been built around my property without my knowledge. The picture that emerged was both impressive and infuriating. My parents had essentially been managing my house as if it were their own, handling all the practical responsibilities of ownership while excluding me from all the decision-making privileges. They'd paid thousands of dollars in taxes and insurance over the years, money I should have been paying as the owner. But they'd also made unilateral decisions about renovations, maintenance, and even landscaping changes that had permanently altered the property I legally owned. The kitchen renovation Mom had organized 3 years ago, the new deck Dad had built the summer before, the fence repairs after a storm last winter, all changes to my property that I'd heard about after. The fact, if at all, it was financial management without ownership recognition, responsibility without authority, caretaking without consultation. And all of it had been happening while I was being treated as the least important family member at gatherings in my own house. The more I learned, the more I realized this wasn't malicious deception. It was something almost worse, unconscious assumption that had calcified into unquestioned family structure. At some point, probably early in the process, my parents had started handling the practical aspects of the inherited property and had gradually begun thinking of themselves as the functional owners. Over time, that functional ownership had become emotional ownership in their minds, and they'd simply forgotten or ignored the legal reality of who actually held the deed. The house had become theirs in every way that mattered to them, with me cast as the grateful beneficiary of their generosity in maintaining the family gathering place. Except, it wasn't their generosity. It was my property, and they'd been managing it without my consent, while simultaneously excluding me from equal participation in family decisions about how it was used. By afternoon, I had gathered enough information to understand the full scope of the situation. My parents had invested approximately $47,000 in property taxes, insurance, and maintenance over 15 years. They'd made decisions about renovations, repairs, and improvements that had added value to the property while treating me as if I had no stake in those decisions. They'd created a family tradition of gathering in their house while systematically marginalizing the person who actually owned it. And they'd done all of this while expecting me to subsidize everyone else's lifestyle and contribute disproportionately to family expenses. The situation was so absurd it bordered on theatrical. But it was also an opportunity for the kind of clarity that only comes from holding all the cards, while everyone else thinks they're playing a different game entirely. I spent that evening planning my approach. I could confront my parents directly, demanding acknowledgement of my ownership and reimbursement for their unauthorized management of my property. I could involve lawyers and make the situation formal and adversarial. Or I could do something more elegant, something that would reveal the truth while giving everyone the opportunity to respond with grace and recognition rather than defensiveness and denial. The plan that emerged was simple, dramatic, and perfectly suited to the family dynamics I'd been observing for years. It would require patience, documentation, and flawless timing. But it would also provide the kind of definitive resolution that years of gentle conversation had failed to achieve. 3 weeks later, I received the call I'd been expecting. Mom, cheerful and slightly frantic, asking if I could help research Christmas dinner options. "I know we talked about doing something smaller this year," she said, "but Jessica suggested we do one last big Christmas at the house before Tyler gets too old to enjoy family gatherings. Something really special, you know." "That sounds lovely," I said, already knowing where the conversation was heading. "The thing is, we'd want to invite everyone. Uncle Paul and Maria, Sophie, maybe even some of the cousins from Colorado. Springs. We could be looking at 15 or 16 people for dinner." I could hear the excitement in her voice, the same enthusiasm she always had when planning large family events. The same energy she'd had when organizing gatherings in my house for the past 15 years without acknowledging that I was the one who should be hosting them. "That's a lot of people," I said. "Where are you thinking of having it?" Well, the house, of course. I mean, it's the only place big enough to accommodate everyone comfortably. And it's so perfect for the holidays with that big dining room and the kitchen space for all the food prep. My house. She was talking about using my house for a large family gathering, speaking as if the decision was hers to make, as if my preferences and availability were secondary considerations to be worked out later. Have you thought about the logistics? I asked. Cooking for 16 people, setting up seating for everyone, coordinating all the dishes and timing? Oh, you know me, I love the planning part. And you're always so helpful with the preparation and cleanup. We make a good team for these big events. There it was again. The assumption that I would provide labor for an event in my own house, that my role was to assist with Mom's hosting rather than to be recognized as the actual host. What about decorations and table settings? I continued. For 16 people, you'd need to borrow chairs and maybe get additional dishes. I've already been thinking about that. There are some beautiful Christmas decorations in the basement. Storage that would be perfect. And I could borrow extra chairs from the church if needed. The basement of my house, where she'd been storing decorations without asking. The dining room of my house, where she was planning to arrange borrowed furniture for an event she was organizing without consulting me. It sounds like you have everything figured out, I said. Well, almost everything. I was hoping you could help with some of the costs. You know how expensive it gets when you're feeding that many people, especially if we want to do something really nice. And there it was, the final piece of the familiar pattern. Mom planning an event in my house, using my space and utilities, organizing the logistics without consulting me, and then asking me to help pay for the privilege of attending a gathering in my own property. How much are you thinking? I asked. Maybe $300 or $400, just to help with the groceries and any decorations we need to buy. Everyone else would contribute too, but you know how these things work out. I knew exactly how they worked out. Everyone else would contribute what they could afford, and I would cover the difference just like I had been doing for years. Except, this time, I would be subsidizing a party in my own house that I wasn't even hosting. Let me think about it, I said. Of course, take your time, but I do need to start planning soon if we want to pull this off. After I hung up, I sat in my new kitchen, looking out at my own backyard, marveling at the perfect symmetry of the situation. My family wanted to have one final Christmas gathering in the family house, with me contributing money and labor while they took credit for hosting. One last celebration where I would be treated as a helpful family member, rather than recognized as the property owner. It would be the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared meticulously. I contacted a lawyer to confirm my legal standing and get advice on how to handle the situation. I gathered all the estate documents, property, records, and financial information related to the house. I researched the value of the renovations and improvements that had been made over the years. Family members occasionally made comments about how I'd changed, usually in the context of explaining why they'd made alternative arrangements for things I used to handle. Mom hired a professional organizer instead of asking me to research vacation, rentals. Jessica figured out how to handle financial crises without calling me for emergency loans. But gradually, something unexpected happened. When I stopped being available as the family's problem solver and funding source, I started being seen as a person with my own life and interests. When I set boundaries around my time and money, family members began asking about my preferences, instead of assuming I'd go along with whatever they decided. The change wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like an equal member of the family rather than its unpaid support staff. The real test came at Christmas, when Mom called to discuss holiday plans. "We're thinking of doing something smaller this year," she said. "Maybe just dinner at our house instead of a big vacation. More low-key." "That sounds nice," I said, and meant it. "Would you be able to bring your famous sweet potato casserole?" "Of course. Should I bring anything else?" "Just yourself. We've missed you." It was a small comment, but it carried weight. "We've missed you, not we've missed your contributions. Or your help with logistics. We've missed you." For the first time in years, I was looking forward to a family gathering where I could simply be present instead of working to earn my place at the table. And when Christmas Day arrived, I walked into my parents' house carrying only my casserole and a bottle of wine, dressed in my favorite sweater, ready to enjoy the company of people who had finally learned to see me as more than just a convenient solution to their problems. The dining room table was set for 7 people, with real chairs for everyone and no folding table in sight. My place card, written in Mom's careful handwriting, simply said Alex, and was positioned between Dad and Sophie, right in the middle of the conversation. As I took my seat at the table where I belonged, I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop doing all the things that prevent people from seeing who you really are. The morning after I closed on my house, I woke up with a strange sense of unfinished business. I'd successfully established boundaries with my family, bought my own home, and created a life where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. But there was still something nagging at me, a loose thread I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't until I was unpacking boxes in my new kitchen that the realization hit me. All these years of family gatherings at the family house on Elm Street, all the assumptions about who belonged where and who contributed what, all the casual dismissals of my achievements and priorities, there was a foundational piece of information that nobody had ever bothered to confirm. I set down the box of dishes I'd been unpacking and walked to the filing cabinet I'd just moved into my home office. In the back section, behind tax returns and employment records, was a folder I hadn't opened in years. The folder containing documents from Grandma Dorothy's estate. My hands were surprisingly steady as I pulled out the papers I'd stored away after her funeral 15 years ago. The will, the probate documents, the property deed transfer. Documents I'd filed away as a young college student who didn't fully understand their implications at the time. But I understood them now. According to the will, Grandma Dorothy had left her house on Elm Street to my beloved granddaughter Alex Chen, who has always shown such care and responsibility. The property deed, dated 3 months after her death, clearly listed me as the sole owner, not Linda and Robert Chen, not the Chen family collectively. Me. I sat in my new home office, staring at documents that revealed a truth so fundamental it recontextualized everything about the past 15 years. Every Thanksgiving. Dinner where I'd been relegated to helping in the kitchen. Every Christmas gathering where I'd been seated as an afterthought. Every family meeting where decisions were made about the family house without consulting me. They had all been happening in my house. The house I'd been excluded from, marginalized in, and treated as a guest in was actually my property. The house where my preferences didn't matter, where my contributions were taken for granted, where I was seated at the kids' table at 35 years old, I owned it. The irony was so complete, it was almost funny. Almost. I spent the rest of the day reading through every document in the estate folder, piecing together details I'd been too young and overwhelmed to fully process when Grandma Dorothy died. She'd been specific in her will about wanting me to have the house because, in her words, I was the one who visits regularly, who listens to my stories, who will appreciate the home I've built here. She'd been right about that, even as a college student. I'd driven the 2 hours from campus to spend weekends with her, helping with yard work and listening to her stories about the neighborhood's history. After she passed, I'd continued to feel connected to that house in ways I'd never been able to articulate. Now I understood why. It had been mine all along. The more I thought about it, the more pieces fell into place. When my parents had suggested having family gatherings at Grandma's old house after the funeral, I'd assumed they meant it was now part of the family's collective inheritance. I'd been dealing with grief and college finals and hadn't paid close attention to the legal details. When Dad had started referring to it as the family house a few years later, I'd thought it was just his way of honoring Grandma Dorothy's memory. When Mom had begun making decisions about redecorating and maintenance without consulting me, I'd assumed it was because she was the most organized family member, and someone needed to take charge. Over the years, as the house became the default location for all major family gatherings, I'd somehow internalized the idea that it belonged to everyone, that I was just one of many family members with a connection to the space. The fact that I had keys and came early to help with preparations had seemed like helpfulness rather than ownership. But legally, financially, and according to Grandma Dorothy's explicit wishes, the house was mine, had always been mine, and my family had been treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own property for 15 years. The anger came in waves, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating kind that comes from realizing the full scope of how thoroughly you've been disrespected. Every time I'd been told to sit at the kids' table, I'd been relegated to second-class status in my own house. Every time family decisions had been made without my input, my rights as the property owner had been ignored. Every time I'd been expected to contribute more money to family expenses while having less say in family decisions, I'd been subsidizing activities in my own home while being excluded from equal participation. The financial implications alone were staggering. 15 years of property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance, and repairs. Costs that should have been my responsibility as the owner, but which I'd never been asked to handle because nobody had acknowledged that I was the owner. I pulled out my laptop and started researching property tax records for the Elm Street address. What I found made the situation even more surreal. The taxes had been paid every year, on time, from an account I'd never seen statements for. The homeowner's insurance had been maintained continuously, with claims filed for roof repairs and a basement flood I'd never heard about. Someone had been managing the property's finances and maintenance for 15 years, making decisions about my house without my knowledge or consent. Someone had been acting as the de facto owner while treating me like an occasional visitor. I had a strong suspicion about who that someone was. The next morning, I called the insurance company listed on the old policy documents. After navigating through automated menus and verifying my identity as the property owner, I was connected to an agent who pulled up the account. Yes, Ms. Chen, we have your property on Elm Street insured under a comprehensive homeowner's policy. The account has been managed by Robert Chen since 2009, with automatic payments set up from his checking account. Is there something you need to update? Robert Chen. Most importantly, I prepared copies of all the relevant documents, organized in a way that would tell the story clearly and undeniably. The will that left me the house, the deed transfer that made me the legal owner, the property tax records showing payments made from my parents' account, the insurance policies managed without my knowledge. Everything needed to show not just that I owned the house, but that I'd been systematically excluded from decisions about my own property while being expected to contribute to family expenses as if I were just another beneficiary of everyone else's generosity. The week before Christmas, Mom called with the final details. 16 people confirmed for dinner, menu planned and shopping list prepared, extra chairs borrowed from the church, Christmas decorations retrieved from the basement storage. It's going to be absolutely magical, she said. The house always looks so beautiful during the holidays. I'm sure it will be lovely, I agreed. Oh, and Alex, I ended up putting you down for $400 to help with expenses. I hope that's okay. I know it's more than we discussed, but the groceries for 16 people turned out to be pretty expensive. $400 to attend a Christmas dinner in my own house, organized by someone else, where I would likely be assigned to kitchen duties while others took credit for hosting. It was such a perfect encapsulation of the family dynamics I'd been challenging that I almost laughed. That's fine, Mom. Should I bring the money with me on Christmas Day? That would be perfect. You're such a blessing, Alex. I don't know how we'd manage these gatherings without your help. Christmas morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of bright winter sunlight that makes everything look sharper and more defined. I dressed carefully in my favorite red sweater and black pants, clothes that were festive but also professional, appropriate for someone who was about to become the center of attention for reasons no one anticipated. I packed my contribution to the meal, a homemade cranberry sauce that had become my traditional offering over the years, along with a bottle of wine and the manila folder that would change everything. The folder was thick enough to make a satisfying thud when placed on a table, filled with documents that would recontextualize 15 years of family history. The drive to Elm Street felt different this time. Instead of going to attend a family gathering, I was going home. Not to the apartment I'd been renting for years, or even to the house I'd recently bought, but to the property that had belonged to me all along without my full awareness. Cars were already lining the street when I arrived, Uncle Paul's truck and Sophie's sedan and Jessica's SUV with Colorado plates. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around inside, the warm glow of lamps and Christmas lights creating the kind of scene that belonged on holiday greeting cards. For a moment, standing on the front porch of my own house, I felt a stab of sadness for what was about to change. These gatherings had been genuinely happy occasions in many ways, filled with laughter and connection and the kind of family warmth that so many people long for. After today, they would never be quite the same, but they had also been built on a foundation of assumptions that were fundamentally unfair to me, assumptions that had shaped how I was treated and valued within the family structure. And sometimes the only way to change an unfair system is to reveal the truth that makes continuing it impossible. I rang the doorbell rather than using my key, a small symbolic gesture that acknowledged I was arriving as a guest to an event someone else was hosting in my house. Mom answered the door with flour on her apron and a slightly frazzled smile. "Alex, perfect timing. Come in, come in. I was just starting the gravy and you know how nervous that always makes me." The house was indeed beautiful, decorated with garlands and lights, and the familiar ornaments that had been stored in my basement for years. The dining room table had been expanded to its full length and set with Grandma Dorothy's good china, the same dishes that had been used for special occasions throughout my childhood, 16 place settings, arranged carefully around the long table, with name cards written in Mom's neat handwriting indicating where everyone should sit. I found my card quickly, positioned at the far end of the table between Tyler and Sophie's boyfriend, well away from the central conversation area where the adults would discuss family news and holiday plans. Even at Christmas dinner in my own house, I was being seated as a peripheral family member rather than the host or even an equal participant. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "Alex!" Jessica appeared from the kitchen, looking stunning, in a green velvet dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Merry Christmas. Thank you so much for helping make this happen. Mom told me about your contribution to the dinner fund." My contribution to the dinner fund, for groceries being prepared in my kitchen, to be served in my dining room, to guests gathering in my living room. I was being thanked for subsidizing a party in my own house. "Merry Christmas," I replied, accepting her hug while mentally noting the phrasing she'd used. Helping make this happen, as if the event were a collective, family effort rather than something being hosted by my parents in my space. The next hour unfolded exactly as I'd expected. I was directed to kitchen duties, helping with last-minute food preparation while others socialized in the living room. I arranged appetizers on serving plates that belonged to me, using serving utensils from my inherited silverware collection, preparing food to be served in my dining room. Uncle Paul asked me to help him move extra chairs from the basement, the same basement where Christmas decorations had been stored without my knowledge. Sophie's boyfriend complimented the house's beautiful hardwood floors, the floors I legally owned but had never been consulted about maintaining. Carlos admired the kitchen renovation, praising Mom's excellent taste in cabinet hardware and tile selection. The renovation that had been done to my kitchen, with decisions made without my input, funded by money my parents had spent as if the property were theirs. Every conversation reinforced the same underlying assumption. This was Mom and Dad's house, where they made decisions and deserved credit for creating a welcoming family gathering space. I was just another family member, grateful to be included, expected to contribute labor and money, but not consulted about major decisions. By the time we sat down for dinner, I felt the familiar mix of appreciation for family time and frustration with my marginalized role. The food was excellent, the conversation was lively, and the overall atmosphere was exactly the kind of warm family celebration that creates lasting memories. But I was experiencing it from the kids' end of the table in my own house, listening to my parents receive compliments for hosting an event in my dining room while having contributed more money than anyone else to groceries that were being prepared in my kitchen. It was the perfect culmination of 15 years of similar dynamics and the perfect moment for revelation. "This has been such a wonderful day," Mom said as we finished the main course and began thinking about dessert. "There's nothing like having the whole family together in this beautiful house." "It really is a special place," Aunt Maria agreed. "You and Robert have done such a beautiful job maintaining it and making it feel like home for everyone." "We've been so lucky to have it," Dad said, his voice warm with satisfaction. "It's been the perfect gathering place for all these years." That's when I stood up. "Actually," I said, reaching for the manila folder I'd placed on the sideboard, "earlier, there's something I'd like to share with everyone while we're all together." The conversation gradually quieted as people turned their attention to me. I could see curiosity and slight concern on several faces, the kind of expression people get when someone disrupts the established flow of a social gathering. "I brought some documents I thought the family might find interesting," I continued, opening the folder and removing the first set of papers. Specifically, documents related to this house and Grandma Dorothy's estate. I placed the will on the table, the pages slightly yellowed with age but the text still clearly legible. "This is Grandma's will, which specifies that she left her house on Elm Street to my beloved granddaughter Alex Chen, who has always shown such care and responsibility." The silence that followed was profound and loaded with implications that different family members were processing at different speeds. I could see Mom's face pale slightly as she began to understand what I was revealing. "And this," I continued, placing the property deed next to the will, "is the deed transfer that made me the legal owner of this house 15 years ago, when I was 20 years old and dealing with college finals and didn't fully understand the implications." Dad had stopped eating entirely and was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Alex, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that this house belongs to me. Has belonged to me for 15 years, and I've been treated like a guest here while you've been managing my property without my knowledge or consent." The silence stretched long enough for the full meaning of my words to sink in. 16 family members sitting around my dining room table in my house, after I'd contributed $400 to buy groceries for a dinner I hadn't planned, hadn't hosted, and for which I'd been assigned peripheral seating. "That can't be right," Jessica said finally, her voice tight with confusion. "Mom and Dad have been taking care of this place, paying for maintenance and taxes and insurance. They've been the ones managing everything." "You're absolutely right," I said, placing another set of documents on the table. "They have been paying property taxes and insurance on my house without telling me they were doing it, and while making all the decisions about renovations and maintenance as if they owned the property themselves." I spread out the property tax records and insurance policies, creating a paper trail that told the story of 15 years of unauthorized property management. "Dad, you've been listed as the account manager for insurance policies on my house since 2009. You filed claims and made decisions about my property without my knowledge." "We were taking care of it," Dad said, his voice defensive but uncertain. "Someone had to handle the practical aspects. You were taking care of my house while treating me like I had no stake in decisions about it." You were managing my property while seating me at the kids' table for family dinners." The phrase hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. Uncle Paul cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly beginning to understand the implications of what he was witnessing. "Alex," Mom said carefully, "we never meant to exclude you from anything. We were trying to preserve the family gathering place that Dorothy wanted us to have." "Dorothy wanted me to have it," I corrected, pointing to the specific language in the will. "She left it to me because I was the one who visited her regularly, who listened to her stories, who appreciated the home she'd built. She didn't leave it to the family collectively. She left it to me specifically. But you were so young," Mom continued, "and in college, and we thought it would be easier if we handled the practical details until you were more established." "I'm 35 years old, Mom. I've been established for over a decade. When exactly were you planning to acknowledge that I own this house?" The question created another uncomfortable silence, because the answer, which everyone was beginning to realize, was never. My parents had gradually shifted from managing my property temporarily to thinking of it as theirs permanently, with me as a beneficiary of their generosity rather than the actual owner. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Sophie said, her voice careful and measured. "Alex owns this house, has owned it for 15 years, but Linda and Robert have been managing it and making decisions about it without consulting her?" "That's exactly right," I said. "And during that same 15 years, I've been expected to contribute disproportionately to family expenses while being treated as the least important family member at gatherings in my own house." Carlos had been staring at the documents with growing comprehension. "Jesus, Alex, you've been marginalized in your own house." "I've been marginalized in my own house while being expected to pay more than my fair share for family events. I've been seated at the kids' table in my own dining room while contributing $400 to buy groceries for a dinner someone else planned in my kitchen." The full absurdity of the situation was finally becoming clear to everyone. I could see family members looking around the room with new awareness, realizing that every family gathering for the past 15 years had been hosted by me, legally, speaking, while I'd been treated as a helpful but peripheral participant. "Alex, we had no idea," Aunt Maria said softly. "We thought Linda and Robert owned the house." "So did I for a long time," I admitted. "But even when I started to suspect otherwise, I was never consulted about decisions, never asked for my preferences, never treated as if my opinions mattered as much as everyone else's." "What do you want us to do about this?" Jessica asked, her tone defensive. "It's not like we intentionally deceived anyone." "I want recognition," I said simply. "I want acknowledgement that this is my house, that I've been subsidizing family gatherings while being excluded from equal participation, and that this dynamic needs to change." "Of course it's your house," Dad said, though his voice suggested he was still processing the full implications. "We never meant to suggest otherwise." "You didn't have to suggest it, Dad. You demonstrated it through your actions. You managed my property without consulting me. You made decisions about renovations and maintenance as if I had no say in what happened to my own house. You organized family gatherings in my space while treating me as a junior participant." I looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member in turn. Every person sitting at this table assumed Linda and Robert were our hosts today. Every one of you thanked them for their generosity in opening their home for Christmas dinner. But this isn't their home. It's mine. It's always been mine. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This wasn't confusion or shock, but recognition. Recognition of the truth and of how dramatically it recontextualized years of family interactions. "So, what happens now?" Uncle Paul asked finally. "Now we acknowledge reality," I said. "This is my house. I've been your host for every family gathering for 15 years, even when I didn't fully understand that myself. And if we're going to continue having family gatherings here, we need to do it with everyone understanding who actually owns the property and who gets to make decisions about how it's used. Does this mean we can't use the house anymore? Sophie asked, genuine concern in her voice. It means that using the house becomes a conversation with me rather than an assumption about Linda and Robert's availability, I said. It means that when decisions are made about my property, I get consulted. It means that when expenses are incurred for events at my house, the financial arrangements are discussed with me as the host rather than assigned to me as a contributor. I could see family members exchanging glances, beginning to understand how significantly this revelation would change family dynamics going forward. And it means, I continued, that I get treated as an equal member of this family, rather than as someone whose primary value is in solving other people's problems and funding other people's choices. The conversation that followed was long, sometimes uncomfortable but necessary. Family members asked questions about the estate documents, about my parents' financial management of the property, about what changes I wanted to see going forward. Some of the responses were defensive, particularly from Mom and Dad, who clearly felt attacked for what they saw as years of responsible property stewardship. But gradually, as the full scope of the situation became clear, the defensiveness gave way to recognition and eventually to apology. "I'm sorry, Alex," Mom said finally, her voice quiet but sincere. "We got so comfortable with the arrangement that we forgot it wasn't actually our house. We forgot that you should be the one making decisions about it." "I'm sorry too," Dad added. "We should have been consulting you all along. We should have been treating you as the owner, rather than just handling everything ourselves." The apologies were genuine, but they were also just the beginning. Real change would require ongoing effort to restructure family dynamics that had been entrenched for 15 years. As the evening wound down and family members began gathering, their coats and saying their goodbyes, several people approached me individually with additional apologies and acknowledgments. "I had no idea," Jessica said, her earlier defensiveness replaced by something that looked like genuine regret. "When I think about all the times we asked you to contribute extra money while treating you like, God, Alex, I'm so sorry. We all just got comfortable with how things were," Carlos added. "But that doesn't excuse not seeing how unfair it was to you." Sophie hugged me tightly before leaving. "You were so gracious about revealing this," she said. "You could have been angry or accusatory, but you just presented the facts and let us understand the implications for ourselves." After everyone left, I stood in my living room with Mom and Dad, the three of us surrounded by the detritus of a large family dinner and the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding. "What do we do now?" Mom asked, gesturing around the room that she was finally acknowledging belonged to me. "Now we figure out how to move forward," I said. "You've invested a lot of money in maintaining this property over the years. That needs to be addressed fairly. And we need to establish clear boundaries about how the house is used for family events going forward." "We don't want your money, Alex," Dad said. "We were happy to take care of the property." "I know you were, but you were taking care of my property, and that created an obligation on my part that I need to fulfill. You spent $47,000 over 15 years on taxes and insurance, and maintenance. That's money you should be reimbursed for." "We can work out the financial details," Mom said. "What I'm more concerned about is whether you can forgive us for not recognizing your ownership sooner." I looked around the room, this space that had been the center of so many family memories, this house that Grandma Dorothy had wanted me to have because she believed I would appreciate it. "There's nothing to forgive," I said finally. "But there's a lot to change. I want to keep hosting family gatherings here, but I want to do it as the actual host, with everyone understanding that this is my house and I get to make decisions about how it's used." "That seems more than fair," Dad said. As we cleaned up, the dinner dishes together, working in my kitchen with my parents for perhaps the first time as equals rather than as an owner and assistants, I felt something shift in our relationship. Not immediately or dramatically, but like the first subtle movement of tectonic plates that eventually reshape entire landscapes. The drive home to my apartment that night felt different from every previous post-family gathering drive. Instead of processing feelings of frustration or marginalization, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally speaking truth that has been waiting years to be acknowledged. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the evening. Family members processing what they'd learned, apologizing for assumptions they'd made, asking questions about how things would work differently going forward. But the text that mattered most came from Tyler, sent from Jessica's phone but clearly dictated by him. "Aunt Alex, thank you for letting us have Christmas dinner at your house. It was the best Christmas ever. Can we do it again next year? Can we do it again next year? Not will we automatically assume we can use your house again, but can we, with your permission, continue the tradition with proper recognition of who owns the space?" I texted back, "Of course we can. It would be my pleasure to host Christmas dinner again next year." My pleasure to host, not my obligation to contribute, not my expected role as family helper, but my pleasure as the homeowner to welcome family members into my space. The distinction mattered more than Tyler could possibly understand, but it represented everything that had changed in the course of one Christmas dinner conversation. Over the following months, my relationship with my family evolved in ways both subtle and significant. My parents and I worked out a fair arrangement for the money they'd spent maintaining my property, with me reimbursing them for expenses while taking over full responsibility for future costs. More importantly, family gatherings at the Elm Street house became actual collaborations, with me as the recognized host making decisions about menus and logistics in consultation with others, rather than being assigned tasks by someone else who was acting as host in my own home. The change wasn't always smooth. Old habits of assumption and marginalization took time to break, and there were moments when family members slipped back into treating me as the helpful contributor rather than the equal participant. But those moments became less frequent as everyone adjusted to the new reality. The most significant change was in how family members related to me outside of gatherings at the house. When I was no longer seen as the person whose primary function was to solve problems and provide resources, space opened up for relationships based on genuine interest in who I was rather than what I could provide. Jessica and I developed a friendship that wasn't built around her financial crises or my ability to help solve them. Carlos and I discovered shared interests in hiking and photography that had nothing to do with family logistics. Even Mom and Dad began asking about my work and interests with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. The house on Elm Street continued to be the center of family gatherings, but now it was a place where I belonged fully rather than peripherally, where I was consulted about decisions rather than assigned tasks, where I was recognized as the host rather than dismissed as just another helper. And on Thanksgiving the following year, when we gathered around the dining room table that belonged to me, in the house that belonged to me, I sat at the head of the table where the host belongs, with family members who finally understood that my contributions were choices to be appreciated rather than obligations to be taken for granted. The transformation wasn't just about property ownership or family dynamics. It was about finally understanding that respect isn't something you earn through usefulness, but something you claim through self-advocacy. For years, I'd been trying to prove my worth by being indispensable, only to discover that indispensability had made me invisible as an individual. When I stopped being the family's solution to every problem, they finally had to see me as a person with my own needs, preferences, and boundaries. When I stopped subsidizing everyone else's choices, they had to acknowledge that my financial resources were just as important as theirs. When I stopped accepting marginalization in my own house, they had to recognize me as an equal member of the family. The house on Elm Street still hosts our family gatherings, but now it's a place where everyone understands the difference between being a guest and being home, where contributions are appreciated rather than expected, where the person who owns the dining room table gets to sit at the head of it. And every time I look around that table at faces I love, seeing genuine respect instead of casual dismissal, I'm grateful to Grandma Dorothy for leaving me more than just a house. She left me the foundation for finally claiming my rightful place in my own family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.